Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, old and new friends from around the globe. And we're here today to attend this online workshop that has been organized by the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation in support with the Finance Center for South-South Cooperation as well as CICETE. So I understand that this is a series of online workshop that is focusing on the resumed SDG-aligned South-South investment beyond COVID-19. And today we are going to focus on the corporate perspectives. I won't go into any more details on how the pandemic is affecting the global economy and the people's lives. As of today, that we have numerous numbers that we can refer to. The economics development has been slowing down. The global south has been greatly impacted. The FDI is down. A lot of people are suffering from the pandemic. It is like the world has been put on pause in a way that we have been going through this rapid growth and rapid development for the past decades. And it is probably time for us to stop and really think what would make the world better and how do we want to go into tomorrow. So as we say in China, there is opportunity in every crisis. So I think it is commonly agreed that if we look at the bright side, we should take the pandemic as an opportunity for everyone to review from their own perspective how to carry forward. And this is really what the UN SDG is about. Sustainable development, social impact is how we would like the world to go into tomorrow. So today we are going to really think from a corporate perspective, because there are government aids, there are packages, there are quantitative easings that has been given out by every government in the globe. But the key for all of those initiatives is for the fundings and for the support to channel through to each and every individual corporates and businesses, as the corporate and businesses are the blood vessel and the driver, the real driver of the economy. So businesses and corporates take this opportunity to really rethink how their development should go into tomorrow. How can they be more sustainable? And how does the global South-South cooperation should play a role in this global rethinking of the businesses tomorrow? So that's why we're here today. We would like to discuss responsible investments. We would like to discuss ESG, and I have in front of me a group of experts from all over the world, from all different backgrounds. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Mrs. Sanda Ojambo. She's the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact is the UN, within the UN system, is the largest initiative that has grouped together more than 10,000 corporates. And Ms. Ojambo has more than 20 years of experiences in sustainable businesses and social impacts. So let's hear what she has to say about the world's future and the sustainable development.
I'm Sanda Ojambo, the Executive Director and CEO of the United Nations Global Compact, and it's a pleasure to speak to you today about SDG-aligned South-South investments for sustainable recovery. Firstly, I'm grateful to the UN Office for South-South Cooperation for inviting me to speak and for organizing this webinar series, which I understand has generated a lot of attention, especially in the Global South. Sustainable development was once viewed as a matter only for governments and specialized development institutions. Recently, though, the 2030 Agenda and the critical issues raised by the COVID-19 crisis have catalyzed unprecedented interest in sustainability and sustainable development from companies and investors around the world. This increase in business interest is critical because building a low-emission, climate-resilient global economy after the pandemic will require sustainable financing and capital at a massive scale. South-South investments can and must play a major role in the coming recovery. That is why, to cite one important example, the UN Global Compact last year launched our action platform on sustainable infrastructure for the Belt and Road Initiative. This is one of several action platforms that we have deployed to accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Each platform convenes representatives from the private sector, government, Global Compact local networks, and their stakeholders to solve complex sustainability challenges. This particular platform focuses on the world's largest network of infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. The platform is committed to helping companies align their investments in these projects with the SDGs and the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact. Our 10 principles span human rights, labor rights, protecting the environment, and anti-corruption. They offer companies a framework for transformational change in the interests of both business sustainability and positive societal impact. And if we integrate the same principles into all South-South investments, we can lay the foundation for sustainable recovery. As the world builds back from the pandemic, financial innovations and blended finance have great potential to guide private investment in sustainable solutions. This is particularly true in low and middle-income countries. SDG-linked financial instruments have already gained traction in the marketplace as a vehicle for companies to finance their own sustainability journeys. These instruments can also create an enabling environment for the private sector to support financing for sustainable development on a wide scale. At the UN Global Compact, we have convened a task force of chief financial officers from major corporations to connect the finance community with the real-world outcomes that boost sustainability. There is a critical need as well to increase the resilience of national, regional, and global supply chains, most critically in the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. We must fully integrate these countries into the international trading system, and we must carve out a much bigger role for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in trade and investment. The only way to achieve such sweeping changes is to meaningfully and measurably scale up business action on sustainability. And that is what our new Global Compact strategy for the next 3 years aims to do. We've developed our strategy to take collective impact of business to a new level. Our overarching goal, delivering results at scale through accountable companies and ecosystems that will enable that change. In pursuit of that goal, we plan a series of strategic shifts, including stepping up our engagement with companies in the Global South and the least developed countries. Through such engagement, we seek to facilitate the transfer of knowledge and resources that can empower many more companies, large and small, global and local, to take their rightful place in a sustainable, inclusive, and equitable green economy. From a business perspective, the prospect of sustainable recovery promises tremendous market opportunities for investors. As the COVID crisis has revealed, companies that perform strongly in environmental, social, and governance indexes are more resilient than others. And as a result, they are more attractive to investors in the context of economic volatility. The UN Global Compact is happy to serve as a trusted partner and supporter of companies and investors committed to aligning their business interests with the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. We are glad to join forces with the UN Office for South-South Cooperation as well, united in our resolution to leave no one behind. Indeed, a just transition to a more sustainable global economy is our best hope for the future of people and the planet. SDG-aligned South-South cooperation and investment will be key to making it a reality. Thank you.
Next, we have Ms. Catherine Ng from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. She is the COO and Head of Policy of the Listing Division. As one of the world's largest stock exchange, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange provides a platform for thousands of top-class companies to access to public funding, which really showcases the best practices and sets the standards for the corporate world. With great impact comes great responsibility. How does such an influential institution contribute to guiding companies towards SDGs? Let's hear from Ms. Ng, Hong Kong Stock Exchange's ESG reporting guide and the implications for companies.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to speak and share with you about our latest development on the topic of ESG from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. I know I just have a couple of minutes, so this will be a very high-level overview of what we've done so far in Hong Kong. So my first slide, this just shows you our ESG journey in Hong Kong. It started about 10 years ago, being a completely voluntary guide. It was moved kind of step by step as our issuers got more comfortable and investors are more sophisticated on the ESG topic. It was moved from purely voluntary regime in 2012 to a comply or explain regime by 2016. And by 2016, every single company had to report on ESG issues. It was no longer a nice to have. They need to have thought about it and publish their thinking on their ESG risks. We've moved up the requirements as the time goes on. 1 or 2 years later in 2017, environmental KPIs became comply or explain as well. So companies with environmental risks must report on KPIs or explain why they haven't done so. And with that, we realized that ESG is quite a new topic to a lot of the issuers in the market, and we need to help the market, train them to understand the ESG issues. Directors need to understand how to manage and steer a company and govern ESG issues. So we've put together a lot of e-training to help directors and listed issuers through this journey. We also have a guide to help the preparers of the ESG report. Now, directors are governing and looking at the governance and strategy of ESG, whereas there are staff in the company, management in the company that needs to prepare ESG information and report. So we've put together a step-by-step guide to help the preparers of ESG report to produce the report in-house should they wish to do so. And in July, this was the latest set of requirements. We last year, this is a set of requirements that came into effect on the 1st of July last year. It was focused very much on the company's governance of ESG issues. Every single company needs to disclose how they're governing ESG issues, what their ESG strategies are, and what the targets are. We put this as a requirement because we heard from a lot of investors that they don't just want to know about ESG data. It's not about regurgitating of ESG statistics, but they want to understand how a company is governing and looking at their ESG risks. So we've put it as a mandatory requirement. Every single one of our 2,500 listed company must consider their ESG risks. They must also explain to their stakeholders how they've picked the ESG risks to disclose, what's material to them, what's not material to them. We want them to disclose ESG information that's important to the company, that makes sense to the company. There's no point formulating policies or managing immaterial risks on ESG. It'll just be a waste of everybody's time. So we want company to articulate how they've looked at the ESG issues, how they've picked which issues are material. And then we've asked companies to explain their reporting boundaries. We have a lot of conglomerates listed in Hong Kong. So where are their reporting boundaries? Which company, which subsidiaries are they including, and on what basis are they including them? A big change that came in was climate change. I think 10 years ago when we started the ESG journey, people thought about ESG as a company's emission. It was how much harmful material, how much emissions a company emitted. But now I think in the past few years, we've realized how important climate change is and how climate change, an external factor, one that is seemingly passive on the part of the company, could impact its businesses. So we want companies to consider whether climate change would in fact impact them and how it would impact them. It has become one of the key aspects. So every single company must consider whether they have climate change risk or not. And company needs to set targets, emissions, use of resources, environmental and natural resources target. And social KPIs, again, no longer nice to have, no longer purely voluntary, but they must consider them. They must, either explain and disclose the social KPIs or explain why it's not important to a company. Now, we've put together a lot of upgrades in the past few years, and it's not easy for companies to digest or to put them together when they've probably not done, a lot of the companies wouldn't have done so beforehand. So with that comes a lot of disclosure. We've put together webcasts, we've put together training materials, we've put together e-training. So there is there's a lot of useful material and references on our website that's available to anybody on the public for anyone who might be interested. And some of them, I mean, they're quite short. We have 5 minutes bite-sized TED Talk type training materials as well. Now, and what to expect in the future. What I mean, a lot of people ask us to look into the crystal ball and kind of try to think about what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years on the topic of ESG. I think 10 years ago, ESG or non-financial information was considered a nice to have. But this day and age, investors need both financial and non-financial information together to make an informed investment decision. In the last couple of years, we've allowed companies some leeway. A lot of companies, they want to get their annual report out of the way, they want to get the CG report out of the way, and then they will disclose the ESG report because they need a bit more time. It's new to them. I think the vast majority of our listed issuers have gotten used to ESG reports in the past few years. In fact, about over two-thirds of them report their ESG report at the same time as their annual report. So one of the things that we're proposing now is that, ESG reports must be published at the same time as their annual reports. And then there is TCFD. I'm sure you've talked a lot about it in this conference. We're expecting TCFD aligned climate disclosure by 2025. So companies do need to get up to speed. They need to familiarize themselves with TCFD and what it means to their company. In Hong Kong government has said that we need to reduce carbon intensity to 70% by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2050. And China, of course, will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So this is not something that will happen overnight. Company needs to plan, and with the ESG report, it could help them do the planning and think about what their targets are and how they will achieve 70% reduction by 2030. It needs planning, and I think investors expect it. You need to explain to investors how you will get there, what your journey is, and what are the actions that will be taken in the next 20, 30 years. And then in Hong Kong, we've set up a working group amongst our regulators. It's called the Green and Sustainable Finance Cross-Agency Steering Group. So SSC, MPFA, FSTB, Environmental Bureau, Insurance Authority, ourselves are all on it. And we are together, as this regulator group, discussing how to produce, or as our respective regulatees to produce useful climate change information and how to ensure kind of comparability across not just across our own industry, but also across the board so that investors can compare. And then lastly, what else to expect? We expect that the international sustainability standards will become consistent and comparable in the very near future. We are at the Exchange working with a lot of standard setters to think about, how do we align? We are conscious that there are few standards out there. It might be hard for investors to compare today, but this is the goal. We need to be able to have information that's useful and that's comparable against all our listed issuers. So I know I don't have much time, and this is a very quick skip, an overview of our regulation in Hong Kong. And I think there's a lot more information on our website for those who wish to read more about it. But I think we are there. We started the journey. We are on it. We are making improvements, and as we go along. So I think we are definitely on track, and we're doing better every day. So thank you for your support and your interest in the ESG journey in Hong Kong. And we hope to achieve greater heights in the very near future. Thank you.
We all understand that for businesses, finance is very, very important, a very important part of making businesses work. And when we talk about ESG, the governance is a very important component of the G, obviously. So we know that in the world of the business, we need to have professional supports. And one of the largest professional supporter and service provider in the world, Ernst & Young, has placed great emphasis in sustainable development and green finance. So today we also have Ms. Judy Lee. She is the Asia Pacific Sustainability Leader of Ernst & Young, and she will be talking to us today about innovations and challenges of corporate governance in ESG investment. Ms. Lee, please.
Thank you, Joyce. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. My name is Judy Lee. I'm the partner of Climate Change and Sustainability Services of Ernst & Young in Greater China. I'm also the regional leader of sustainability in Asia Pacific. I will be focusing on innovation and challenge of a corporate governance in ESG investment. For ESG, we know that it stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it actually reflects the capacity of a company to achieve sustainable development in long term. Environmental indicators include different impacts of companies on the environment and related profitably in future. For instance, the KPIs including emissions, climate change mitigation and adaptation activities, biodiversity protection, hazardous and non-hazardous waste management, energy use, energy conservation, and etc. For social impacts, it include indicators focus on business relationships of the companies, like the type of numbers of employees, gender issues, products, service chain, and etc. More important, governance. This is a topic I'm going to share with all of you. Governance indicators directly relate to the operation of a company's core business, management approach, governance structure, and internal policies. So when we talk about the ESG, we put the order as a E as the first letter and G as the last one. However, according to our experiences and practices, G, governance, means fundamental. So it's kind of like a basic performance of listed companies, and also it will generate the future of environmental and social impacts. So that's why we talk about the ESG investment. So ESG investment means that institutional investors to make decisions of investment include both financial and non-financial figures. So nowadays, more and more investors, they are trying to calculate the long-term value of the investees, like how to say these companies or projects will generate CO2 emission reduction, will contributing to UN SDGs, will support the GDP development as well as GEP. So more and more investors, they are focusing on ESG investment. And EY has conducted a survey on global investors in the last continuous 5 years. According to the survey, over 98% of engaged investors evaluated the non-financial performance of their target companies. The proportion of investors who incorporate ESG into requirements is gradually increasing. And also, we already found that there are some famous ESG rating agencies. So they provided the rating results for the listed companies, including different stock markets like Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen, of course, the mature market like London, Singapore, Paris, Bloomsburg, and New York, Tokyo, and as well. So all of these stock exchanges, we can see that there was some report from the ESG rating agency to announce that which companies will get higher rating from rating AAA, and which kind of companies may have to receive lower ratings, the lowest CCC, so or only 1C as well. So how these ratings reflect the general performance of a company's non-financial figure, it will also include these, the future development of the company's financial development. So when we say the ESG rating, ESG investment, it actually covers 4 levels. So the first level is the 3 major categories of ESG, the 3 focal areas. The second level is the themes on the ESG. The third level is material issues on the themes. And the last but not the least is the KPIs. So KPIs in different stock markets, the ESG guideline a little bit different. However, the major KPIs are between 30 to 36, covering environmental indicators and the social indicators. But of course, how these companies perform is really based on the development of a structure of the board, of the director, CEO, and the entire governance performance. So that's why we say, how to determine the elements of a board's efficiency. So relevant to ESG rating. So usually we can easily calculate the environmental benefits. For instance, CO2 emission reduction. There are different methodologies of industries, sectors to use and adopt UNOSSC or ISO 14064 to calculate the CO2 emission reduction. And for social impacts, we can also generate the figures of a job generation, the gender balance, and other related KPIs as well. But for governance, how to determine a good governance is a challenge for investors. So when we say the board's efficiency, it will include the independence of the board, also include the CEO's independence, and as well as the, the diversified of the board members. So all of these related issues will, to determine a board's efficiency at a listed companies. And the second one is related to a CEO. The CEO's compensation is reviewed by the general meeting of shareholders. So we can see that some listed companies, they set up very clear governance structure on the CEO. Sometimes they even set up a committee of sustainability. So some companies, they regulated a position called CRO, Chief Responsibility Officer, or CSO, Chief Sustainability Officer. So this kind of structure will greatly encourage the company to focus on the sustainability related issues. And of course, this structure will under the guidance from the board and the CEO, and then the structure will generate the strategy of a ESG and the action plan and the expected results to be achieved in certain amount of time. So that's why we see the good example from business practices. A company will set up a 5-year plan of sustainable development. The CEO will be the one to take the role of a CRO or CSO. Under the CRO or CSO, there will be a committee, the committee called sustainability. And of course, there will be a task force or the office to execute the actions of the sustainable development. So for the ownership, so we can also see the ownership structure determines the internal ownership of a company as well as the profit distribution. So ESG ratings do not particularly favor a certain equity structure, but more consider the equity risks among the shareholders. the shareholder supervision, and the interest protection of small and medium shareholders. So there's a key scoring point of a ESG rating is for these structures, for the companies, for the key managers of a different departments to be owned by, have the ownership for the sustainability. But the last but not the least is about the ESG evaluation methodologies. So we can also see that in different markets, like mature stock exchange markets or the emerging markets, the rating results might be different. So for the emerging market, the companies should establish, actually the local ESG evaluation system, and also to provide investors with a set of ESG investment decision-making tools that are more compatible with local features, environment, and national development. So we can see a good ESG performance rating or a good ESG investment activities should include both international structure as well as a local regulation. So I would like to share with you some solutions we have been working out with different stakeholders, including large-scale companies, international enterprises, and the local entities. So we have like a ESG performance analysis model to support the companies to better identify the ESG performance with a full picture. For instance, taking China as an example, so there are over 3,700 Chinese companies listed in Shanghai and Shenzhen, and in Hong Kong, there are over 300 Chinese companies listed in Hong Kong. So in total, for Greater China market, there will be over 4,000 listed companies. And how to determine their ESG performance, we need to have a comprehensive data source. We have a full picture of a database, and to include both the local KPIs and international standards. So it will help the investors to better understand how these A-share Chinese companies perform in terms of the ESG. So to conclude, we have been working very closely with international organizations like UNDP, like other UN agencies, and also working closely with the regulators in different countries, in China, CSRC, CBRC, in different countries in Asia Pacific, like Singapore MAS, Japan, Australia, Malaysia stock exchanges. So we are trying to provide an international-based ESG performance analysis for investors to better understand how the governance, how the ESG performance will influence the final result of the financial reporting of these listed companies. So we have been supporting the company to build up their governance structure of a ESG to assist in establishing the corporate ESG strategy governance structure, and also to set up the targets, indicators, scenarios of action plans, and optimize the governance structure by sorting out and clarifying roles and responsibilities of all levels and departments in responding to climate-related risk. And also for investors, we will conduct the ESG performance products. For instance, some large-scale public fund or equity fund or banks, they need to have a full picture of the ESG products. So how to design a ESG investment products and tool. And for another part is to the risk control, right? How to better control the risk that we can conduct climate-related risk model, the stress testing, for asset management owners and for insurance companies. And the last but not the least is the disclosure, reporting. So for listed companies and investors, you need to disclose the required information by regulators, so to present to the capital market and the international society how the company performed in terms of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, how to prove that these achievements have been in line with the UN SDGs and how to calculate these environmental and social impacts. So the last but not the least, we have been working in the field of sustainability for over 40 years. So very pleased to receive awards for the sustainability. And of course, very pleased to be here today again. And so nice to talk with all of you and see all my old friends and new friends, and hope to get in touch with all of you for building a better working world and more sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. That was very exciting. Actually, for me to hear about like one of the largest professional services provider in the world, assisting thousands and thousands of corporates around the globe. You are focusing on ESG and you're introducing standards and systems. I'm sure you will contribute greatly in guiding investors and corporates towards a more sustainable future. Thank you, Ms. Lee. So, we all know that in this new era, technology is changing every aspect of our lives, not to mention every aspect of the businesses. Every business should be thinking about how technology can help them to move towards where they want to go and can become a tool for them to achieve what they want to achieve. So today we also have on our panel Dr. Renata Tiobo. She's an advisory board member and part of Alibaba Global Initiatives at Alibaba Business School and is affiliated Taobao University. She is also the Chief Operating Officer of consulting firm Green Proposition and assists governments and SMEs on digital transformations to create opportunities for small businesses. So, Dr. Tiobo, I would like to really hear about what do you have to say about technology, especially artificial technology. How do they empower corporates' ESG investment in alliance with international standards and national regulations? Please, Doctor.
Hello, everyone. And I am going to share a little bit about my experience, especially working with e-commerce in China for over 10 years. And e-commerce is very much related to artificial technology, right? So I am going to bring you some case studies that also happen to help alleviating poverty, for example, and bringing societal changes through technology. So today I am going to present on how artificial intelligence empowers corporations and also equiparate them with international standards and national regulations as well. So e-commerce is very much related to internet penetration, also the mobile usage, together with some basic structure, for example, logistics for the delivery of goods and also online payment. And the two enablers of e-commerce in any country are regulations and, of course, financing. So with the pandemic, we really could see that business, they had to reinvent. So many retailers, they had to shut down, they went into lockdown period. And because of this, companies, they had to digitalize, and sometimes they did not have the means to do so. So globally, the e-commerce share compared to retail increased around 17%. And the surprising fact is that the e-commerce activities globally, they accelerated into 4 to 6 years. And e-commerce goes hand to hand with artificial technologies. So for example, e-contract and very important technology now that we are developing very well is the blockchain for food traceability and smart logistics. So what's e-commerce? I have worked with some UN papers, with WTO, and there is still this misconcept about e-commerce, especially towards the definition and the differences between these transactions of goods and transactions of services online. So regardless of the type of business, if it's C2C, B2C, B2C, B2B2C, and any transaction happen on apps, also websites, marketplaces, they are regarded as e-commerce. And for SMEs, it is very important because it can reach a very large consumer base. And you do not need to be constrained to just your region. You can sell online not only to different places within your country, but also outside of your country with cross-border e-commerce. And of course, it generates job opportunities, and it reduces many costs that you have with rent, with electricity, etc. So like I said, internet penetration is one of the main enablers of e-commerce. And it is very interesting that you can also see the gap between countries and how e-commerce develops more or less in countries, and how this internet penetration influences these online activities. So there was a big increase of user penetration globally. It went from 46.6% in 2020, and it is projected to reach 63.1% in 2025. However, in Africa, this number is 19%. So you really can see the gap with not only international internet penetration, but also with B2C e-commerce, for example. So here I have two graphs. So you can see Kenya, for example, they have a very good share of internet users in Africa. Commerce. So it is very correlated with internet penetration. On the other hand, you have Chad here on the bottom, only with a B2C e-commerce, the index is very low according to UNCTAD, and the same goes to internet usage. So there are some platforms that are really trying to boost e-commerce globally. But not only that, you need to provide not only finance, but also regulation preparation. You also needed to help countries to implement digitalization into business. So eTrade for All is one of the most important platforms for e-commerce globally. And they help developing the skills, they help with regulations, they have a whole assessment for countries to improve their online activities. And the countries also provide finance to list developing countries for them to develop their infrastructure. So recently, the Dutch government announced an additional funding of $1.5 million for different countries through this platform. Then you also have WTO that is still implementing some e-commerce protocols. They're still under negotiations, but I do believe that e-commerce has been moving very fast, has been developed very fast globally. However, the regulations, meaning national ones and the international ones, do not follow the same path and not in the same speed. ASEAN is perhaps the most developed bloc that has many functions towards e-commerce. They do have, for example, guidelines on how marketplaces can operate. Then you have the integration frameworks for all of the members to implement e-commerce activities. Also, they have some plans that they draft between 2019 and 2025. And also they have a whole committee also for e-commerce. And then lastly, in Africa, there are also some plans and very good opportunities with the new integration of 55 African countries. So e-commerce is one of the fields that the organizations, and especially African Union, wants to push within AFCTA. However, the plans have been a little bit slow, and they plan to implement and achieve some e-commerce goals, such as technological transformation by 2063. So all of this cannot happen without financing. So I do see AI and e-commerce as a triangle based on 3 E's that we call. The first one is entrepreneurship and also digital transformation, then education, and the last one is e-government. E-government means all of the basics for infrastructure, also regulations and logistics. So the financing that should be public and private is on the bottom of this pyramid to lift and to help e-commerce activities globally. So surprisingly, over 200 million small medium enterprises in the global south lack access to financial services. And we found that the main reason is lack of regulations. So if you do not have regulations that really help these governments to boost either at the country level and also at the global level with cross-border e-commerce, for example, or free trade agreements between countries or bilateral agreements as well, you cannot improve online activities globally. And here you have a clear example of what has been happening in China in the past years with e-agriculture. So agriculture and e-commerce, they go hand to hand with poverty alleviation in China. So even the Chinese government has thanked some internet companies here in China for the role for them to really bring societal changes into the countryside. So you have, for example, in 2018, e-agriculture itself reached over 230 billion renminbi, which is around $35 billion. And you had over 13 million farmers selling online. So bringing e-commerce with AI and all of these efforts for development in a country is very important, because you cannot have such support without having multi-stakeholder effort, right, to bring all of these changes in the society. So you needed to provide training capacitation, especially to the farmers, to teach them new technologies, also to enable them to use online technologies, but also for farming, right? In the case of China, there was a big reduction into the usage of water, for example, or with the help of the logistic providers of the internet giants in China, there was no need of middlemen. So you could bring the food from farm to fork without having the middleman. So hence the price would decrease as well. And it would be very interesting for consumers. Okay, so this is what I would like to share today, and how agriculture is really helping China to increase also the GDP that you can see here in the graph. And thanks for the efforts from the private industry together with federal and local governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. That's exciting, because every day we're enjoying technology and the convenience that technology has brought us. It is very good news for us to hear that your work is really helping to direct technology to help companies and to help the users to achieve the goal of ESG. And also you mentioned in your presentation how regulations, cross-country agreements and policies should also play a part in helping businesses to use technology towards the goal of ESG. So that is very good news for all of us. So thank you. Next, we have invited Mr. Jonathan Gilliam. He's the head of risk advisory of Deloitte & Touche's South Africa, to share with us some cases that he has seen from the Global South related to the challenges and countermeasures in ESG investing at corporate level.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. My name is Jonathan Gilliam, and I'm the Energy and Resources Leader for Deloitte's Risk Advisory business in Africa. I'm also a senior manager in our sustainability practice and work with our clients across some of their most pressing ESG challenges, essentially helping clients across climate and decarbonization through to setting their sustainability purpose and strategy, down to some of the specifics around circular economy, ethical value chain, as well as the ever important ESG reporting and sustainability disclosures landscape. I have the pleasure of taking you through and talking to you today about some of the challenges and countermeasures in ESG investing, particularly at a corporate level. If we take a step back and really think about the past 12 to 18 months, I think one of the major positives to have come out of the past year, if the only thing, is really the renewed focus and commitment to ESG investments. With sustainable funds having seen record inflows over the past month and new fund launches at an ever increased height, I guess, these launches are definitely likely to continue accelerating, particularly as demand spreads across geographies and down south, and particularly as the investor types evolve. We know the investment community and society as a whole have really been putting increased pressure on the public and private sectors to demonstrate climate action and essentially account for greater responsibility around their ESG priorities. At the end of the day, investors want to make sure that they're investing in firms that are actually championing and leading the ESG agenda, rather than those that are contributing to climate change or to social injustice problems. The oil and gas sector has, in the last weeks, come under massive scrutiny and are having to really rethink and reassess their future business models and their strategies in order to evolve and really remain relevant. Many companies are clearly making a concerted effort to align with the principles of shared value and social consciousness. And there's a growing acceptance that material ESG factors can be tied to a company's long-term performance. In terms of some of the other factors that's driving this change, besides the obvious elephant in the room of climate change, I guess, there's also the factors of social and governance, which have definitely been brought into sharper focus over the past year. Governments are also going green, and there's now 197 odd countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement. And as a result of this commitment, we're seeing increased changes to regulation and to policies, some of which will make ESG disclosures mandatory. There's several initiatives already underway in the EU, and this will inevitably be echoed across Latin America, Africa, Asia Pacific, and of course the rest of the world. One can't talk ESG investing without mentioning the impact of sustainability savvy investors from a millennials and Gen Z perspective. These investors understandably want their investments to reflect their environmental and social values, and certainly shouldn't be underestimated. If we shed a light then on a couple of regional perspectives, maybe starting with Latin America, I think Latin America in particular over the past few years has been one of the most rapidly growing regions with regards to impact investments. There's been a major focus obviously in the region on renewable energies, but interestingly enough, the sector that's received the greatest impact investments in recent years has been the agriculture and food industry, at around 159 million US, which accounted for 30% of total investments between 2018 and 2019. Really gives you an idea of the sheer scale and size of that focus and investment space. While the COVID-19 pandemic has had far-reaching economic implications for the region, and of course the rest of the world, it's definitely accelerated the climate change agenda and highlighted the need to prioritize and impact investment and impact investing rather in Latin America. and essentially the associated investment policy. Closer to home for myself, from an Africa perspective, we're still somewhat less mature, but there's definitely been some notable gains made in the region over the past months, with many countries now adopting the SDGs and having signed up to the Paris Agreement. I think we're up to 33 countries in total at the moment across Africa. There's definitely an increased spotlight on the topic, particularly given the fact that many global mining companies, oil and gas majors, consumer companies, as well as wider manufacturers operate across Africa. As mentioned before, these companies all are coming under increasing pressure, and they're having to plan and implement strategies around different topics and different factors around, for example, reducing their carbon emissions, being more accountable for their water footprint, essentially ensuring that their supply chains are responsible and ethical. And there's obviously the building of sustainable relationships with stakeholders, particularly with communities in which some of these majors operate. Banks and financiers have also been coming under increasing pressure in Africa, particularly around some of the environmental activists, regarding the bank's funding of fossil fuel projects. Some banks are now making commitments to adopt climate strategies, but they're obviously cognizant of some of the challenges associated with setting credible targets. Post-COVID-19, the business landscape is expected to shift, and companies are needing to adopt new business models and disruptive technologies, despite the uncertainty surrounding Africa's socioeconomic outlook. If we move east, in terms of ESG investments, they've also definitely accelerated and picked up in Asia Pacific over the past year. And some pundits actually feel confident that this momentum is going to grow and continue, such that the region could even surpass other regions and become a leader in ESG progress. In Australia, interestingly enough, our Deloitte colleagues actually publish a quarterly clean tech index, which essentially is a review of the clean tech stocks listed in Australia. These stocks have both environmental and economic benefits, and cut across different subsectors. So everything from water to renewable energy, sustainable minerals, green buildings, waste, recycling, carbon trading, etc. The clean tech sector itself is fundamentally different to socially responsible investments or ESG performance. SRI and ESG look at incremental improvements in company performance, and can be seen as operational hygiene measures that find the best in class. Clean tech, on the other hand, focuses on companies whose output positively enhances the communities and the ecologies in which they operate. Essentially, it's about doing more good rather than less bad. So in terms of some considerations that companies need to kind of keep in mind and be aware of, I think it's safe to say that sustainability is not just a trend. It's the science is there, the writing's on the wall, and companies can no longer get away with simple compliance mindsets when it comes to their sustainability mandate. Given that credibility is expected to really lead the next wave of ESG principled investing, companies really need to be careful of not greenwashing. And I think, just doing that tick box exercise in order to attract ESG investment can lead to real risks, and I think it can really come back to bite you. It's one thing to set ambitious targets, but it's critical to actually understand how you're going to meet those commitments. So whether that's around moving to a net zero target, whether that's around your emissions, so on the emission side, whether that's around your water use, or whether it's around engaging with your supply chain and responsible supply chain, even down to at a social level around the people that you work with, your stakeholders, the communities that you engage with. Really, really critical to ensure that whatever targets, whatever commitments you're setting, you've obviously got a clear plan on how to meet those and then how to get there. I think linked to that, it's obviously one thing to set targets, but you really need to make sure that you've then got cascading metrics across the organization. So from the board, from the level of the board and the senior executive, all the way to middle management, and essentially to your folks who are at the coalface. Linked to that, I think remuneration should inevitably have a role to play and should be linked to staff performance around meeting targets, meeting expectations, meeting those criteria. Money does influence behavior, and it's a bit of a carrot stick scenario, but I think it is something key to kind of keep in mind. Very importantly as well, on the topic of strategy, I think it's not enough to have sustainability strategy in isolation, which we open once a year, we assess, we all focus on. I think it's critical that organizations start to look at how they're embedding this into their business strategy and across the operations, so as to really see the dial moving. Linked to this is obviously the topic of data and analytics, and actually having real-time access to information in real time and across the organization, so that decision makers can make more efficient, effective, real-time decisions based on current information, and where needs be, readjust, realign, and refocus where required. I think in closing, today's climate crisis is really urging each and every one of us to rethink and reinvent our economies. In order for companies to attract sustainable ESG investment, they really need to be fundamentally relooking and changing how they're approaching sustainability in order to create a lasting impact that's actually going to matter, and that's going to have a long-lasting effect on the world and the communities in which they operate. That's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, cheers.
So now we're moving on from what we just had, the governance, the G part of the ESG, to the S part of the ESG, social impact. I always think measuring social impact is not just important, but is very challenging as well. The positive social impact and the negative social risks are embedded in every behavior of a company, and it is very hard to quantify them and to really bring standards into this area. So now we have an expert in this area, Dr. Lisa Sachs, the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University. And she's going to provide us with her views on the social side of the ESG. Dr. Sachs has rich experience in research in development, investment, and sustainable financing. So we would love to hear your view in how to manage social risks of ESG investment, especially in labor and supplier perspectives. Dr. Sachs, please.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to be learning from and talking with you about these really important topics. So thank you to the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation and the wonderful partners for organizing this series of webinars and inviting me to contribute. I direct the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, where we study and promote the role of investment in achieving sustainable development. And our work recognizes the critical roles and influence and responsibilities of the many institutions and actors, government officials, companies, investors, international financial institutions, banks, and so on, everyone whose policies or practices shape investment, the scale of investment, where it goes, into which geographies, into which sectors, with which qualities and impacts, and so on. So I'd like to start this reflection with a reminder of the core concept of sustainable development and a snapshot of where we are today. The idea of sustainable development is a fundamentally good and important idea, that we are aiming for a world that is prosperous, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. It's not a new idea. It dates back at over 30 years to the Brundtland Commission. But despite repeated efforts to motivate the transformations that have been needed to achieve sustainable development, we have strayed even further from that goal. In large part, the challenge of sustainable development is that our economic systems and our political systems do not create socially inclusive, environmentally friendly, sustainable development, very much to the contrary. Our global economy and most national economies continue to generate huge and growing inequalities and contribute to unprecedented and worsening global environmental crises of irreversible climate change, of massive pollution in a variety of forms, exhaust, pesticides, toxins, chemicals, plastics, and so on, of massive species loss and loss of biodiversity, and of pandemic diseases. The COVID pandemic, as with other zoonotic pandemics, is triggered by changes in land use, climate change, and other human-induced disruptions of animal habitats. The COVID crisis has also made painfully visible how vulnerable many in our society are, and how uneven and unequal our protections and our provisions are. It's shocking to me that as many millions of citizens globally faced growing food insecurity and increased poverty, job loss, and health crises, that the richest 500 people in the world had a rise in their combined wealth of approximately $1.5 trillion in 2020. So as we focus on a recovery from COVID, it is critical that we focus on restoring economic activity, but without simply restoring our old pattern and trajectory of worsening environmental degradation and widening inequality. Let me just say one thing about the role of governments, which is that it is key in this effort. Again, there is nothing inherent in markets that helps to achieve environmental crises or address, let me say, environmental crises or social crises like inequality. And achieving the SDGs will require fundamental structural transformations in a number of key sectors. Governments are critical in setting the policy frameworks for those transformations. The European Green Deal is one example. The idea is to create the incentives and the structures, the laws, the penalties, and other governance tools that organize and structure the rest of society, and that arrange for the redistribution of benefits, of social safety nets, of the provision of public goods like infrastructure, healthcare, food security, education, the basic needs of society. But the transformations to sustainable development and climate safety also require the deep engagement of the private sector. But although the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement recognize the critical role for the private sector and the critical need for additional financing, the business and the financial sectors still lack clarity and consistency on what SDG alignment looks like for businesses or for responsible investors, for ESG investors or ESG funds or products or other financial flows. There has been a proliferation of sustainability reporting by companies, of sustainability reporting frameworks, of guidance, of ratings, and so on. But this proliferation, in my view, has actually contributed to a lot of confusion so far, not to too much serious realignment. Many of the companies that boast of their strong sustainability credentials continue to contribute to worsening environmental and social outcomes and widening economic inequality. I think there are many factors that contribute to this disconnect. In part, this is the result of self-reporting by companies and a wide range of SDGs and an even wider range of ESG metrics and frameworks and criteria that allow companies to cherry pick what they are reporting against and what they are purporting to do, or the actions they are taking, and overlooking other critical aspects. And that I would say actually is one of the second contributors, is that many ESG frameworks overlook critical aspects of business engagement with companies' stakeholders, with their value chains, with policy-making efforts that are decisive for understanding companies' overall alignment with the SDG transformations. On the financing side, SDG-aligned investing, or broadly ESG investing, as we've been learning about, and the various tools and funds take very different approaches to definitions, functions, and even purpose. But it's important to note that, as with corporate reporting, the growth in ESG investing has coincided with a worsening of outcomes, not an improvement. I think in part, this is also because ESG investing as a whole is not actually designed for impact. It is largely a risk mitigation framework with a view to maximizing long-term profits, rather than as a means of realigning our unsustainable economy with our planetary boundaries and our social goals. So in our view at CCSI, the right starting point for business and for the financial sector is to really understand and to adapt to the deep transformations that are needed of decarbonization, reduced inequalities, universal access to healthcare and education, and so on. Second, and crucially, businesses need to adopt the basic ethical principle of do no harm. That businesses should be making profits only by adding to true social value and not by imposing costs on others in the form of pollution, monopoly power, tax evasion, the selling of private data, land grabs, or a range of other antisocial actions, even those that might be legal or achievable without getting caught. But third, let me say that I think businesses and their investors should and could recognize the opportunity to invest in businesses of the future, as I like to call them, providing the goods and services that are both necessary for and consistent with the SDGs and climate safety, that will create new jobs, that will align with new policy frameworks, that will meet the growing calls for accountability. These are real growth opportunities. The financial sector, including ESG investors or responsible investors, in my view, have two fundamental roles. The first is to support these fundamental transformations in our economy through rigorous and robust assessment of business alignment and meaningful engagement with corporate management. That is not yet a part of traditional ESG practice, the impact perspective, actually working with the companies that one owns to ensure alignment. And the second is to support the financing of critical investments, especially in developing countries, which I think is mainly to be done by capitalizing regional development banks. So let me conclude with saying that businesses and ESG investors play an absolutely critical role in achieving sustainable development and in the COVID recovery, but we have a ways to go to align these roles with the broader SDG transformations that are needed. I strongly believe that governments, consumers, and other stakeholders can support these much needed transitions in the business sector and in the financial sector, and that focusing on this COVID recovery provides a really wonderful window of opportunity. So thank you again so much for letting me share my thoughts, and I look forward to reflections.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. I am very impressed with your frankness in facing what is really needed to be changed in the businesses, not just the behaviors, but in the minds and consciousness of the people behind the businesses. ESG is not just a slogan. It's not just 3 letters. It's not just when people are thinking, I am doing good, but it actually goes beyond that, and it goes into the transformation of every aspect of people's behavior as well as their mind. I am very, very impressed. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, Dr. Sachs. So next, we are now moving towards the E of the ESG, the environment. And the environmental impact is probably the most obvious one out of the 3 letters, the ESG. But it is really not the most easiest problem that we're facing. So right now we have on our board, Dr. Prasad Modak. Dr. Modak is the Executive President of the Environmental Management Center LLP of India, and he is also a member of the India Resources Panel at the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. Prior to his services to the government, Dr. Modak has also worked in all key UN multilateral and bilateral development institutions. So I would say that Dr. Modak is a true expert in environmental science and management. Dr. Modak, we are very excited to hear about your view on challenges and opportunities on environmental sustainability under India's environmental and social governance. Please.
All right. Thank you very much for this opportunity. What I plan to do is first walk you through with the evolution on the environment and social management in India, giving you a kind of a bird's eye view, how over a period of time, the government made its efforts to address the environmental challenges in the country. And then I will also start explaining how different new stakeholders started coming in. And it was not just then the regulatory approach of the government, but the government started playing a facilitatory role in some sense. But then we also got on board the judiciary, very active judiciary in India on environmental injustice. And then as we heard from previous speakers, entry by investors and investors asking from the investee companies, so to say, a proof that they would be satisfied with their environmental and social management frameworks before they either take an equity or lend their money. So there has been an evolution over a period of time, and greater now as we see citizen involvement in the environmental and social governance. And I will, at the end of my talk, make some observations that how do I see the way ahead, especially after everyone realizing the importance of responding to climate change. Now, the story in India's environmental governance, actually, if you look at it, was inspired from the Stockholm Convention of 1972. And then Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, when she was asked, that, is always quoted that, what's the form of pollution in India? And she said, poverty. And that is how she responded that time. I think if you look back, that statement is still true. And it in many ways resonates to what Professor Sachs talked about. And when we talk about the resource allocation, availability, fairness, and equity, there lies a challenge because of the poverty. And the response at that time after the Stockholm Conference from Government of India was to set up a Department of Environment, which then over a period of time became the Ministry of Environment. And while the ministry came up with their policy frameworks, then came a series of enactments for enforcing the emissions resulting from various developmental activities. And therefore, the Ministry of Environment, through the Parliament, passed several enactments. And the reason I'm telling this story is because often it happens that you begin with a media like wastewater, and then you add on to that the next one like air emissions to be managed and solid and hazardous waste. So typically, same thing happened in India, that the legislations got enacted to prevent and control water pollution, then the prevent and control air emissions, and so on and so forth. And regulatory bodies had to be set up. And being a federal country, India had to set out at each state of the country a regulatory authority as well as a policy-making authority. So each state set up their departments of environment and then set up the pollution control boards, which were given the responsibility for enforcement of the laws. And the Bhopal tragedy that India faced in 80s led to the Parliament moving to an umbrella legislation, the Environmental Protection Act. And this was out in 1986. And that is the ruling umbrella act today for India's environmental governance. And the Environmental Protection Act over the last 2 decades, 3 decades progressed by formulating many rules to manage plastic waste and the construction and demolition waste, the municipal solid waste, spent batteries, and so on and so forth. So a myriad of legislations came about from the Environmental Protection Act. Now you have to realize that the regulator, however, in this journey wasn't strengthened enough, or the capacities were not that much adequately built. And therefore, while the policies and legislations were in place and pretty responsive to the concerns in terms of damages being caused to the environment, the enforcement still remained weak and is still weak today, that it is not really that effective as it was intended to be, mainly because of this whole challenge of very limited human resources at the regulator, not just the human resources, I would also say technical resources, that they were not easily and it's still not available with the regulator. Now that being one story, that the governance took a path of enforcement and using legal instruments to contain the pollution that was released. In many cases, when that was not satisfactorily enforced, which led many times, not just to the environmental resources getting depleted or degraded, but it also affected the livelihoods of people, especially in rural areas, who lost their agricultural lands, or they really were in a situation of a very severe water scarcity and so on and so forth. And in 2010, the Government of India came up with the National Green Tribunal Act and set up the green courts to address people's concerns whenever they found that there was environmental injustice. And India becomes really a good example to see how strong the judicial activism has been. And that judicial activism, and also I would say judgments from many of the very celebrated judges in India, led to reforms in legislation as well as in policies. So this was interesting, that there was not just now government enforcement, but people had an access to the green courts and file public interest litigations. Now, while that was on and the business was coping up by investing on pollution control equipment and also showing their sensitivity to their neighborhoods, there came a CSR Act, the Corporate Social Responsibility Act, and also extended producer responsibility related legislation. And these two together really brought in that the businesses had to think beyond the factory gates. And in many ways, you could say it brought in a more understanding of stakeholders, the stakeholder mapping as an important activity in the business strategies. And we started seeing a transformation gradually in the industry, that the business was looking also now, not from the environmental perspective alone, but social, and also assuming a responsibility. And in some businesses, they also looked at this as a way to demonstrate their leadership. And this kind of a change one started seeing over the last 10 or 15 years. Businesses making every attempt to demonstrate they mean to do responsible business. But remember, these are not something very commonly seen examples. There are many businesses who don't regard environment as their responsibility, that they must protect and conserve. But then came, I would say, last 10 years, an investor push to the businesses. And the investors, while they were happy to see that there was a compliance shown to the legislations of the country, they had their own performance standards. They had their own codes of practices, which they asked the borrower or the investing company to comply. And today, if you look at the investment canvas in the country, in India, it's already more than 2 trillion, which have gone under the sustainable investments. And businesses are establishing environmental social management frameworks or systems at the fund level and also at the investee level. So I would call that as another, if you were to say 360 degrees, on one side you had regulations and you had a judiciary, and you also now have a third dimension of investors coming in and asking questions, and not just at the time of investment or deal making, but also charting out a monitoring activity post the engagement. to ensure that there was a continued compliance. Now, not just only to the national legislation, but also recognizing good international industry practices. The GIIPs started coming in, and I think slowly I would say that the governance started going beyond compliance. So we began with compliance, regulations, enforcement, and now some of the enlightened business houses recognizing that if they want to survive and compete and excel, they need to look at ESG in material sense, and then use that direction as a strategy for their future business. And I would just end saying that the added complexity to the triangle, what I talked about, was the whole issue of risks being posed by the climate change. And the climate change related risks at the asset level, in terms of asset vulnerabilities, looking at instruments such as climate insurance, and also disclosures needed through mechanisms like CDP or TCFD that we see as picking up in the country. And I think next couple of years, what I would see is a sharp, in terms of industry response getting sharper. And not just industries, I would say the cities, as a city is another smaller subsystem of governance, also looking at how to be more and more climate resilient. And the evidences are clear that India is facing today so many frequent cyclones and floods that the assets at the city level are getting, in many cases washed away, losing their value. So you do see an interest being shown from the city governance. In terms of summary, I would say that while this has been a change over the last 30, 40 years in India, I think I would say India is a typical example, and you would see a similar experiences in other developing countries, that they're also going through such a transition. But I think probably the policy, regulatory push, or the market push, or investor expectations are moving faster than the capacity to deliver. So I do see that there is a mismatch, and therefore we probably will go through some kind of a perfect storm in the next 4 or 5 years. And I'm sure that that perfect storm will teach us lessons enough that how do we ride on this opportunity, I will call, in some sense, but also hedge against the kinds of risks, especially on the natural resources. I'll stop here, Joyce, and thank you once again to all of you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Modak. I can hear the passion through your speech. And I think the world has witnessed how far India has came through in the past couple of decades. I'm really thrilled to hear the government's effort in protecting the environment. And this practice is really funneling through to other stakeholders of the Indian society, with the public sector, the private sector, as well as the financial industry. And your research clearly has covered them all, and you're giving out very clear guidances. Where should India go? And to that extent, really, like, the purpose of this kind of workshop is to share best practices. And I think there is something for every one of us to learn from. So thank you very much, Dr. Modak. Within the business world, one thing that we should never overlook is the legal risks associated with all kinds of business behaviors, especially for cross-border relationships. This is why today we have invited Ms. Lin Yang, the executive chairwoman and a founding partner of Yingke International Law Firm. Ms. Yang initiated Yingke Global Legal Services Alliance, which currently covers 83 countries. I think she is best positioned to speak to us about managing legal risks of cross-border ESG investment. Ms. Yang, please.
Dear colleagues, it's my great honor being invited to participate in this webinar to talk about the management on legal risks related to ESG investment. Well, the scope of ESG is very wide. It includes greenhouse gas emission, environmental policies, energy consumptions, and biodiversity under environmental aspect, and it includes gender and gender balance, human rights policies, working regulations, product responsibilities, and other compliance issues, and the social aspect. And under governance, it includes corporate governance, corruption and bribery policy, anti-unfair competition, risk management, tax transparency, etc. So under ESG, the scope is so wide and complicated. And the more complex issue is that in different countries, there are different systems for ESG. The laws and regulations are very different from one country to another. So it's very challenging for a foreign investor to make investment in a country which you are not familiar with. Here, I would like to share with you a case, which is a real case. We have a client who is a very successful businessman. He owns 3 public companies. He purchased a piece of land on a very beautiful island in Canada. And the purpose is to develop luxury houses. He has many friends who promises to purchase the houses after he finished the development. So he thought as the owner of this piece of land, he can do whatever he can. However, according to the local regulation, the community has a right to vote whether they agree for you to develop it or not. So the result was the local community voted on rejection for his development of this piece of land because the people of the local community believes the development of real estate would destroy the natural environment of the island. Well, such failure was obviously caused by negligence and unawareness on local regulations. It can actually be avoided by a thorough and comprehensive legal due diligence before the actions were taken. Another example is a road construction project in a European country. The company win a project is a public bidding project by a very lower price because they want to knock the door of European market by this project. However, the same happened. They didn't do any homework. They didn't understand the requirements of the laws and regulations. Under the environmental protection law, 7 types of frogs are protected. So namely, if you build a road, you need to keep channels for frogs to cross the road. You need to leave certain channels in accordance with a requirement of the law. Just for this requirement, the cost increased 30 million euros. They even don't know the existence of such environmental law. So obviously it's not included in their quotation. And eventually the company had to breach the agreement. And of course, they suffered from lots of losses financially, and also there were lots of impact on the reputation of the company. In 2020, China became the largest country for outbound investment. The total amount of direct investment reached $160 billion from China to the rest of the world, and many deals were achieved through mergers and acquisitions. It's very challenging to finish an acquisition, but it's more difficult to achieve integrity in the stage of post-acquisition. Corporate governance is one of the key parts to achieve integrity. It's not only about laws and regulations, but also with other factors like culture and mentalities. It's quite common that after the acquisition, the new owner to arrange the new management team to replace the previous senior management team. The new managements, maybe they are very professional, very experienced in certain sector, and they are very trustworthy. However, in terms of understanding on the local culture and mentality, they are not really comparable to the previous management team. Well, Geely Auto, which is a Zhejiang-based private company in automotive industry, give a very good example in corporate governance on its acquisition with Volvo, which is a Swedish company. Geely Auto acquired 100% of the shares of Volvo in 2010. After the acquisition, Geely didn't oppose any existing policy of the company to Volvo. They insisted the strategy of independent operation. On the principle of frequent communication and mutual respect, they achieved gradual integrity eventually. After the acquisition, they set up a dialogue cooperation committee. Each party appointed 4 members to the committee. There were 2 meetings every year, and the committee members, they made decisions related to key issues on the company, like product development, technology application, branding, and training program, etc. So that's a very good example in corporate governance after the acquisition. There are more issues related to ESG for investment on some certain sectors. For example, in mining sector, for investment in mining sector is always capital intensive and with a long period of investment. The stakeholders at various stages of the project are very complicated. There are issues with the local government policies, local regulations, the community building, the land ownership, the labor rights, and also many other issues related to ESG. There's an initiative which was launched by the former Prime Minister Tony Blair of the United Kingdom in 2002, which is known as EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Well, this initiative promotes the transparency, accountability, and good governance in the management of extractive industries. Currently, there have been 54 countries joined this initiative, which requires two-way disclosure of corporate payments to government department to prevent bribery, corruption, and other unfair competition. This is also very challenging for companies making investment in mining sector. Well, to manage all of these risks could be very challenging, and it's not something easy. Here, I would like to share with you a simple recommendation, that is to find right people to support your strategy. Right people includes both internal and external people. For internal people, you should find your senior management and employees who really have global mindset and experience, not only in the relevant industries and sectors, but also with experience in certain countries. And external people means the lawyers, accountants, and consultants who can give you very professional opinions and support you to be successful and achieve your business purpose. Thanks again for the invitation from the organizers on this event. As a Chinese lawyer, I will continuously to support our clients on their ESG-related investment globally. I'm also very glad to hear more experience and good practice from other colleagues, so I can share this information and experience with our clients to make more contribution to South-South cooperation, as well as to the achievement of SDGs. Thank you very much.
Now, I am delighted to introduce our guest who is going to give us the closing summary. Dr. Xiaojun Grace Wang, the Deputy Director of UNOSSC, an old friend of mine. I work together with Grace in many occasions, events, and initiatives, and I can tell you that her leadership and her passion really moves beyond any single perspective, but pans across all aspects of SDG. Grace led many initiatives to help the Global South to power through, to work their way out in the crisis. And I cannot emphasize how much Grace has contributed to bring South-South cooperation into practice, and how realistic the realistic meanings of Grace's programs have already been implemented. I would like to invite Grace to give us the closing summary, and would like to hear your thoughts on how the alignment of SDG prior, during, and beyond COVID-19 it is for South-South cooperation. Grace, please.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Thank you for this wonderful introduction that really humbled me a lot. I would first like to thank all the speakers today for sharing your insights and recommendations on how responsible investment have contributed to and can be scaled up to better support the attainment of SDGs from corporate perspectives. The rich discussion we had today analyzed the opportunities, the key challenges, and also showcased specific good initiatives in institutional, policy, and legal frameworks around ESG at corporate level. This is the third webinar in a series of webinars called Resuming SDGs-aligned South-South Investment Beyond COVID-19. And this is jointly organized by United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation, Finance Center for South-South Cooperation, and China International Center for Economic and Technical Exchanges. The first two webinars focused on the global trend and the policy perspectives. Together, we have benefited from 27 policymakers, regulators, researchers, and investors from 22 institutions, organizations from around 15 countries around the world. They all share their knowledge and inspirations with us. So today, let me reflect on the three webinars, on the very rich knowledge that I have learned from all of you. Why we are organizing webinars on this topic. Since the adoption of the SDGs, we actually see evident progress on investment in some critical sectors for the achievement of SDGs. But we also see stagnation in sectors such as education, water and sanitation, in sectors that will determine whether we have a sustainable future or not for the next generation. So this is a sense of urgency that has brought us together. We also realized that when you look at the specific sector investment, well, we probably find a very limited amount, but there is a huge market beyond just specific sectors that can be aligned with SDGs and contribute to the overall cause of sustainability, which is about 10-fold of the amount if you only look at sectoral specific investment. So that's why we're thinking aligning those huge amounts towards SDGs would be somewhere that we hopefully can find an answer to this urgent question. Now, COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the challenge with steepest downturn in FDI. However, we have only 10 years left to deliver on the SDGs. The demand for investment is high, but the time is short. Where do we look for solutions then? We're looking for solutions from the SDG-aligned investment including but also beyond investment specifically targeted on SDG sectors. We're looking from the global south and especially the rising emerging economies. We're looking for the answer from partnership between public and private sector engaging development banks. So throughout the 3 webinars, 4 very important levels of understanding have been brought forward. The fundamental level that was also emphasized by speakers today is the transformational change. It is about the basic principle of doing no harm and doing good for the world. It is about what are the transformational sectors and the business for the future that we should all support to lead the world towards. The second level is about policy and regulatory environment. Only if we can together build an enabling ecosystem for more and better investment aligned with SDGs, we can unite actors to work together. And the third level is about tools, frameworks. Tools such as ESG frameworks as safeguards to facilitate and guide investors. And then the next level is about technology and digital transformation, which offers an opportunity for investment to enhance the utilization of the responsible investment frameworks and toolkits to facilitate better alignment of investment with SDGs. So these are the 4 levels of understanding and knowledge shared on this important subject. However, cutting across all these levels, as someone working in the office promoting cooperation internationally, I keep thinking, so what are the inspirations we should take away, and what can a UN office for South-South cooperation together with our wonderful partners do beyond these webinars? Now, I have heard a few recommendations I would like to share with all of you, and then I invite you to share even more concrete proposals with us so that we can together create partnerships to take this journey even beyond sharing of knowledge. The first recommendation is about addressing the transformational issue. Together with research entities and investors and industry leaders, policymakers, we could identify what are the sectors that has this transformational impact for achievement of SDGs, and what are the business that should invest more, business of future, but also transitional investment to bring old sectors to modern and sustainable paths forward. And in this process of identifying those sectors and business, how do we leverage the digital transformation, the assets that our time offers us for the future? So that's the first thing that I think is an opportunity for us to do together. Second, a global ecosystem for responsible investment. Nurturing that investment to engage all stakeholders, to jointly own and collectively engage in policies, regulations, and disclosure frameworks, including ESG integration, promoting an international policy dialogue to incorporate knowledge, experience, and realities of developing economies to promote more operationality of ESG frameworks in the emerging markets, and also let the developing economies contribute their good practices into the shaping of the framework, into the shaping of the policies and regulations internationally. The third element we can work together, I think, is to connect partners. As some have articulated, critical sectors for SDGs are often the responsibilities of public sector. Well, we know that the money actually is not there. So how do we bring together public sector, development banks, regional banks, and private sector together, not on the traditional projects or on things, on sectors that we identified as really transformational initiatives, and to bring those, pull the resources together in a way that have concerted effort to invest in those sectors. That's the third idea. The fourth one is about knowledge and capacity development. What we have been doing through the series of webinars is to engage the practitioners and policymakers from developing economies, from developed world, to better harmonize with international practice and support innovation in this area. So we will continue doing that and take that kind of knowledge sharing and capacity development to a level of creating meaningful partnership. The discussions of the 3 sessions, we will try to summarize it into a knowledge product. And I welcome all of you to contribute your research and your ideas into this knowledge product. On a final note, together with our partners, this webinar series is supported under the Global South-South Development Center project, GSSDC. This is supported by the government of China since 2009. It has benefited from a public-private partnership to really broker institutions from different countries to work together. So when we talk about transformational sectors, this Global South-South Development Center as a network of centers of excellence, of do tanks, are promoting 4 sectors in 2021. Agricultural value chain, environment and biodiversity, renewable energy, and digital innovation. We welcome our partners to join hands with us and work out some ideas and some efforts to really bring SDGs to the heart of investors and to align investment towards the achievement of a sustainable future for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you. Wow, what a session. In just 1.5 hours, we have heard insights from different backgrounds and perspectives across industries, institutions, and geographical span. It's amazing to see all your top talents together with every one of us are working towards a shared goal of SDGs-aligned South-South investment. I would like to say thank you to all our guest speakers today for sharing your precious views and insights with us today. I would also like to thank the UN Office for South-South Cooperation and CICETE for organizing and co-organizing such platform for the benefit of all of us from the Global South, to exchange thoughts, to learn from each other, and most importantly, to feel the support of each other during this difficult time. Let us keep such spirit strong and move sustainably beyond COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good day.